I was never the kind of woman who dreamed of fairy tales. Life had already been cruel enough to dissolve any illusion of princes or perfect endings by the time I turned 24. At that point, I was a single mother with a toddler who barely spoke, a part-time job cleaning offices at night, and a heart still in pieces from the man who walked out when he found out I was pregnant. There were no stars in my eyes, just deadlines, diapers, and dark circles. I wasn't looking for love. I didn't even believe I deserved it, which is probably why, when Matthew came along with that smile that felt like summer after a decade of winter, I didn't know how to react. He was charming in that dangerous, intoxicating way. Not loud, not exaggerated, not the kind of man who stands in a room and demands attention, but the kind who draws yours without even trying. He spoke with this quiet confidence, with perfectly measured silences between his words. He noticed things. He asked about my son, not as a burden, but as if he genuinely cared. He said he liked women who had been through something, because they had real depth. At the time, I didn't recognize that as the first bait on the hook. It started slowly, like fog creeping in while you're looking the other way. He brought me flowers once. Just once. I remember that because I pressed the petals in an old book I used to read before sleep stopped coming. He said he respected me, that he admired how hard I worked. He said things no one had ever said to me before, and part of me, against my better judgment, started to believe them. He began showing up on the days when I was most exhausted, with takeout food I didn't ask for, movies I didn't have time to watch, and this air of someone who was doing me a favor by simply existing in my life. It didn't feel transactional, not at first. It felt like a lifeline, like maybe I didn't have to be so strong all the time, like maybe someone could hold some of the weight. He didn't move in, not officially, but his shoes appeared by the door one day, and his toothbrush quietly joined mine on the sink. It wasn't long before his words changed tone. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, praise became advice. Advice became correction. Correction became criticism. "You're working too much," he said. "You never have time for me." And then, "Do you think this is the life you want for your kid? You exhausted all the time, dragging him around." At first, I agreed. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was too busy to notice how much I was failing. Maybe I did need someone like him to steer me in the right direction. That's the thing about erosion. It doesn't happen all at once. You don't wake up one day and find the coastline gone. It slips away grain by grain, until one day the ocean is inside your house. The first time he said something that made me flinch. He was joking. At least, he said he was. We were arguing over something. I can't even remember what. And he said, "No one wants a single mom with baggage. You're lucky I'm still here." Then he laughed and said I was too sensitive, that I needed to relax, that he was just trying to keep things real. But the words had already lodged themselves somewhere behind my ribcage. That was the first night I slept with my back turned to him. Not in anger, in silence, in recognition. I didn't respond, and that silence became a pattern. He would say something sharp. I would absorb it. And the next morning, I would still make coffee and fold his shirts, as if nothing had happened, as if I couldn't hear the subtle shift of a lock turning inside me. I started doing little things differently. I'd change the way I dressed. I'd hesitate before posting a picture online. He began commenting on what I wore, what I fed my son, what I said around other people. I wasn't trying to appease him, at least not consciously. I just wanted peace. I was tired of the tiny arguments, the way his face twisted when I disagreed. I started to question my instincts. I used to think I had a strong intuition, but under Matthew's gaze, everything became murky. If I said something he didn't like, I was overreacting. If I asked for space, I was acting cold. He never yelled, never raised a hand. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he withdrew affection like oxygen and made me feel like I had to earn it back. My son began to notice. He didn't say it, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. The way he clung to me when Matthew entered the room. The way he played more quietly, as if trying not to disturb the balance. I hated myself for staying. I hated myself more for not knowing whether staying was really that bad. That's what psychological abuse does. It doesn't just make you question your worth. It makes you question your perception of reality. I kept telling myself that I should be grateful, that at least he wasn't like the last one. that at least my son had a man around, that maybe love meant compromise, and maybe I was just too damaged to recognize it properly. But somewhere deep inside, a part of me knew, not in words, not in thoughts, just in weight, a quiet dread that never left. A feeling that I was becoming a background character in my own story, that I had traded survival for invisibility, and yet I kept playing the role, the partner, the peacekeeper, the woman who was lucky someone still found her desirable, baggage and all. He called it baggage the second time during another joke at dinner. I laughed with him, then locked myself in the bathroom for 15 minutes, staring at my reflection, trying to remember the woman I used to be. I don't know the exact moment when the golden promise turned into a cage. Maybe it was when I started checking the tone of my voice before speaking. Maybe it was the day I stopped dreaming out loud. Maybe it was when I looked at my bank account and realized I had no savings, no autonomy, no plan. I had built my world around a man who saw me not as a partner, but as a woman lucky enough to have him. He hadn't put me in a cage. I had. I decorated it myself, and I smiled through the bars. But even cages grow rust. Even fog lifts. Even a woman drowning in self-doubt can find solid ground if she kicks hard enough. I just didn't know then that the same words he used to belittle me would one day echo in a glass office with my name on the door and his resume in my hands. That part comes later. For now, I was still inside the cage, still holding my breath, still convincing myself that maybe I was too sensitive, maybe I was lucky, maybe this was love. And he, the man who told me no one would ever want someone like me, was still sleeping beside me like he owned my silence. But even then, something small had begun to stir, the beginning of something he never anticipated. A thought, a spark, a plan, not for revenge, not yet, just for escape, for air. And when it came quietly, like most miracles do. He said it like a fact, like the weather, like gravity, not in anger, not even in cruelty, just in that detached, surgical tone he used whenever he wanted to sound logical. We were standing in the cramped kitchen of the apartment I had worked 3 jobs to hold on to, the air heavy with the scent of leftover lentil soup and something deeper, sourer, like the slow rot of resentment. I had just finished telling him about a small freelance opportunity I had found, something modest, writing copy for a local brand. But before I could finish the sentence, he cut me off. Why waste your time? You'll never be anything with all that baggage. I froze. The words landed like glass shards under my skin. I didn't even answer him. I remember looking at the dishes in the sink, the way a thin crack had started to snake its way through one of the bowls, and thinking how fitting that was. Something breaking, silently, under pressure, unnoticed, until it finally split open. He walked away as if nothing had been said, as if I hadn't just felt my insides recoil. And I did what I had grown used to doing. I buried it, swallowed the hurt like medicine, forced a smile for my son, and finished the night pretending nothing had changed. But everything had. I began to see the layers more clearly after that. The slow build-up of his contempt disguised as honesty. His compliments had stopped months ago, replaced with suggestions, and then with warnings, and now with final verdicts. My son, Jacob, had started to avoid him more obviously. He no longer called Matthew uncle like he used to. He barely spoke around him. And still I stayed, because leaving felt like climbing a cliff with no ropes, and I didn't know if I had anything left in me to survive another free fall. I didn't have a family to run to. No savings, no car, and a job that barely covered rent. I told myself I was enduring this for Jacob's sake, that maybe a roof over our heads was more important than my pride. But even that excuse began to feel hollow when I noticed how Jacob shrank whenever Matthew's footsteps echoed down the hall. That sentence, "You'll never be anything with all that baggage," played on loop in my mind. Baggage. That was what he called my son. That was what he called my past. The trauma I had survived. The scars I didn't choose. And in one phrase, he reduced all of it to dead weight I was supposed to be ashamed of. I started to observe him more closely after that, not as a partner, not even as an adversary, but as a pattern. I saw how he enjoyed offering just enough approval to keep me dependent. He never outright forbade me from working, but he mocked my efforts. "You're wasting time you could be spending with your kid," he'd say, followed the next day by, "Don't expect me to carry all the weight." I couldn't win. I was always either neglectful or inadequate, too ambitious or too lazy. And the worst part was, I believed it. I started to believe I was, in fact, broken, that I should be grateful someone tolerated me at all. I remember the night I broke down in the bathroom while Jacob slept. I had opened my laptop to work on a proposal for that same freelance job, just a one-page document, but I couldn't do it. My hands were shaking. I kept hearing his voice in my head laughing at me. "You? Build something? Who would trust a single mom with no degree and no pedigree?" The screen blurred with tears and I slid down the wall, sobbing into my knees, the tiles cold against my back. That was when it hit me, not like a revelation, but like a quiet, devastating truth I had known all along. I wasn't just afraid of failing. I was afraid he was right. I began waking up earlier, quietly, before he stirred. I'd make coffee and sit on the floor with my notebook, jotting down anything, ideas, names, even quotes that made me feel sane again. I didn't know what I was building, but I knew I needed to build something that belonged to me. I couldn't stay in a life where I had to earn the right to exist, where love was a debt I was always failing to repay. Each morning I'd write a little more, steal fragments of time when Jacob was at daycare or napping, and every word I wrote was like stacking a brick toward the exit. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He began asking questions, laced with sugar and venom. "You're not becoming one of those boss babe types, are you?" he'd say with a smirk. Or, "It's cute that you're trying, but don't forget who's paying the bills around here." By then, I was already planning. Not revenge, survival. I stopped arguing. I stopped explaining myself. I played along just enough to keep the peace while quietly cutting cords. I reached out to an old classmate who worked in tech and offered to help her with admin tasks remotely. She paid me barely anything, but it was mine. It was the first money I made without his name anywhere near it. And it felt like oxygen. I began hiding envelopes of cash inside a hollowed-out book. 50 here, 20 there. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Then came the day he came home furious because I hadn't made dinner. I had been working all afternoon while Jacob watched cartoons, and I simply forgot. He didn't scream. Matthew never screamed. Instead, he smiled, the kind of smile that made my stomach twist. "This is what happens when women start thinking they're men," he said. "They forget how to be useful." That night, after Jacob fell asleep, I packed a small bag, just the essentials: birth certificates, Jacob's favorite stuffed dog, a flash drive with everything I had written. I didn't know where we were going yet, but I knew we couldn't stay. I slid the book with the hidden cash into the bag, zipped it shut, and placed it by the front door. I didn't sleep. I lay next to Jacob, listening to the sound of Matthew breathing, wondering how long it would take him to notice we were gone. I imagined all the things he'd say if I confronted him, how he'd twist my reasons into accusations, how he'd say I was unstable, ungrateful, hysterical. And maybe I was. Maybe I was all of that, but I was also done. The next morning, I waited until he left for work. I told Jacob we were going on an adventure. He was too young to understand, but he smiled and clung to his stuffed dog. I held his hand as we walked down the stairs. My heart was pounding, my breath shallow, but for the first time in years, I felt alive. I didn't look back. Not once. He said no one would ever want me with all that baggage, but what he didn't know, what he never could have understood, was that my baggage was the very reason I was stronger than him. Every weight he tried to hang on me became a rung on the ladder out. Every insult was a spark. Every dismissal, fuel. I wasn't nothing. I was not broken. I was a woman with a child and a storm inside her, quietly building something he would never see coming. And when he did, when our paths crossed again in a place he never imagined I could reach, it would be me with the power to say nothing at all, or to say his name, just once, with the calm of someone who had already won. It didn't happen overnight, though in hindsight, I sometimes wish it had. Sudden cruelty is easier to name, easier to run from. What Matthew did was slower, subtler. It was like standing in water while someone turns the heat up degree by degree until you forget what it's like to breathe cold air. I used to believe we loved each other. or at least that he cared. That illusion didn't die quickly. It faded, smudged, became something I didn't recognize until one morning I looked across the table and saw pity in his eyes instead of warmth. Not the kind of pity that comes with concern, but the kind that makes you feel like an embarrassment to be endured. He looked at me like I was a project that had failed, and he was simply too noble to throw away the pieces. That was when I realized what I had become in his eyes. An obligation. A woman who didn't quite deserve cruelty, but certainly didn't deserve respect either. It started with comments wrapped in sarcasm, then wrapped in silence. I'd spend hours cleaning, working, tending to Jacob, cooking something from scratch, something I used to love doing, and he'd walk in, sniff the air, and say, "What's that smell? Burnt again?" Then he'd eat anyway, without thanks, without eye contact. The compliments had stopped months ago, and now even basic decency was fading. I began to anticipate the disapproval, to flinch before he even spoke. Sometimes the silence was worse than anything he could say. It was strategic. A way to remind me that he didn't need me, that I was the one who needed him. He never yelled, but he didn't need to. He had learned how to speak with sighs, with disapproving glances, with doors closed just a little too hard. The love, if it had ever been real, curdled. It turned into something bitter and clinical. He started introducing me differently, no longer as his partner, but as the mother of that kid, as if Jacob wasn't his responsibility, wasn't part of our life. In public, he'd perform decency, smile, hold doors, make jokes. But behind closed doors, I became invisible. I could be in the middle of a sentence and he'd pick up his phone and walk away. I could cry and he'd shrug. I began to feel like a ghost in my own home, a prop in a narrative I had no say in. There was a night I remember more clearly than the rest. Jacob had a fever. I stayed up with him for hours, pressing cold cloths to his forehead, whispering lullabies I barely remembered from my own childhood. Matthew came home around 2 a.m. I was sitting on the floor beside Jacob's mattress, bleary-eyed, hair tied in a loose knot, my shirt stained with applesauce and worry. He stepped over us, literally stepped over us, and went straight to the fridge. No questions, no concern, not even a glance. I remember thinking, he doesn't see us. Not really. We're background noise, static. He poured himself a glass of juice, sat on the couch, turned on the TV, and laughed at some late-night show while I rocked our son through chills. That was the night I stopped telling myself he was just tired, or stressed, or emotionally limited. That was the night I let the truth settle fully in my chest. He didn't love us. Not me. Not Jacob. He tolerated us the way someone tolerates an unwanted chore. In the weeks that followed, he grew bolder. He began making jokes about single mothers in front of me, laughing with friends on the phone loud enough for me to hear. Once he said, "Man, these single moms are so desperate these days. You give them a little attention, and they think you're their savior." I don't think he even realized what he was doing anymore. He had stripped me of individuality. I was a category now, a demographic to be mocked, a living example of the life he believed only he had elevated from ruin. And the worst part? I still cooked. I still cleaned. I still smiled when Jacob was watching, because I didn't want my son to see the fractures. But inside, something had turned. Not just broken, shifted. There was a moment, a small, ridiculous moment, that marked a quiet turning point. We were in the living room. He was scrolling through his phone while I folded laundry on the couch. Jacob was drawing with crayons on the floor, humming softly to himself. Matthew suddenly chuckled and read aloud a tweet. "No one wants a woman with baggage, especially not baggage that walks and talks." He laughed. Hard. I looked at him. He looked at me. There was a beat of silence. Then he said, "Relax. It's a joke. Don't get so defensive." Jacob looked up, confused. I looked down, folded the last shirt, and stood up slowly. That night, after putting Jacob to bed, I went into the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror for a long time. My face looked older. Not just tired, drained, hollowed out. I touched my cheek and whispered, "He's not even hiding it anymore." Contempt had replaced every trace of affection. I stopped trying to be seen. It was too exhausting. Instead, I began watching. I paid attention to what mattered to him. I learned how he thought, how he moved. I memorized the hours he left and returned, the apps he used, the things that triggered his praise, the things that made him retreat. I wasn't being paranoid. I was studying my opponent, because by then, I knew I couldn't stay forever. I just didn't know when or how I would leave. But I was no longer in denial. The man who once said I had depth now treated me like debris, and there was no coming back from that. One afternoon, while Jacob was napping, I found an old picture of myself tucked into a notebook. I must have put it there during the move. It was a photo taken before I met Matthew, before life had carved the lines deeper into my face, before my laughter had been rationed. I looked fierce, unapologetic, eyes full of ambition. I stared at her for a long time and felt a knot tighten in my chest. That woman hadn't disappeared. She had been buried, suffocated, but she was still there, somewhere beneath the weight he had convinced me I carried. I began writing again, not for anyone else but myself. Pages and pages. Thoughts, plans, numbers, lists. I wrote down every phrase he had used against me, every insult he had passed off as a joke, every time he had made me feel small. I didn't know what I'd do with it yet, but it helped me remember that his voice wasn't mine, that I didn't have to believe it. He started staying out later. I didn't ask where he went. I didn't care. When he was home, he barely acknowledged me, and that suited me just fine. The less he noticed me, the more I could rebuild without interference. He thought he had broken me, that I was too dependent, too used up to go anywhere. He thought his contempt was a leash, but it wasn't. It was a door, and one day, I would walk through it without a sound. The day he replaced love with pity, I began to hate him. But the day he replaced pity with contempt, I stopped fearing him. And that changed everything. Because fear is a cage, but hatred can be a key. Especially when it's quiet, focused, and patient. He didn't know it yet, but the woman he looked down on, the one he thought was nothing more than baggage, was already planning the empire she would build with nothing but grit and spite. He thought he'd erased me, but I was still here, watching, waiting, remembering everything. There's something cruel about how the world keeps turning when yours is slowly coming apart. I remember nights where I'd lie beside him in that too-small bed, my body curled toward the wall, pretending to be asleep while he snored softly behind me, breathing like nothing in the world could touch him. I envied that sleep, that oblivion, the ease with which he disappeared from the day while I lay there counting the cracks in the ceiling, begging the dark for answers, for a way out, for the version of myself I used to be. The apartment was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like a staged scene from a life I was only pretending to live. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, deliberate, like it had weight and shape, like it was pressing down on my chest. In those moments, I didn't cry loudly. That would have been too disruptive, too noticeable. Instead, I let the tears slide quietly across the bridge of my nose and onto the pillow, one after the other, until the dampness soaked through, and I had to turn over and start again. Jacob would sometimes shift in his sleep across the room, murmur something soft, and I'd remember that I wasn't completely alone. But even that thought brought guilt. What kind of mother was I? Lying in the dark, paralyzed by a sadness I couldn't name while my son dreamed of things I couldn't give him. I had convinced myself I stayed for his sake, for stability, for routine, for a man-shaped presence in the home that might resemble family, even if it didn't resemble love. But children are smarter than we give them credit for. Jacob had stopped asking Matthew for anything, stopped hugging him, stopped speaking his name out loud. I wondered when that decision had been made in his tiny heart, what moment had finally taught him not to seek warmth from cold stone. And that thought, more than Matthew's indifference, more than my exhaustion, shattered me most, that my son was learning silence from me. During the day, I wore masks, smiled when I had to, laughed at work, kept the house running, played the part. Matthew liked that. He liked his version of me, efficient, quiet, grateful. He never struck me, never raised his voice, never cursed. But there was a violence in his calmness, in the way he walked past me like I was furniture. in the way he corrected the way I poured his coffee, without ever thanking me for making it in the first place. There were entire days where the only words he said to me were logistical. What time is dinner? Can you get more detergent? Did you pay that bill? No affection, no acknowledgement, just the rhythm of shared space, not shared life. I became a background noise he tolerated, and yet he slept, like a man with no demons, like someone who had never been questioned, never been told no, never had to carry the weight of someone else's heartbreak. The nights were the worst. I stopped dreaming entirely. Sleep became a negotiation. If I drifted too far into it, I'd wake up in panic, afraid I had forgotten something important. Jacob's medicine, a freelance deadline, the face of the girl I used to be. And so I stayed in a half-sleep state, eyes closed, heart racing, mind spinning, the kind of sleep that doesn't heal you, the kind that just delays your breakdown by another day. Sometimes I'd get up and sit on the floor in the hallway, holding a cup of tea I never drank, staring at the closed door of Jacob's room like it was the only real thing left in my life. There, in that sliver of space between our bedrooms, I would let myself unravel. Not loudly, not dramatically, just slowly, like the thread of a sweater being pulled, one breath at a time. I'd scroll through job listings on my cracked phone, heart sinking each time a requirement appeared that I didn't meet. 3 years of experience. Bachelor's degree preferred. Must be available full-time. I had none of those. Just hunger. Just quiet rage. Just the fire of survival burning low in my gut. Too small to light anything yet, but too stubborn to go out. I thought about the money I had managed to save, the notebook full of sketches and ideas and quotes I had written to myself like prayers. It wasn't much. It wasn't even enough to rent a room, but it was something. It was more than I had the year before. It was the first evidence that I wasn't completely erased, that I still existed beneath the dust. He didn't notice the changes. Men like Matthew never do. He thought I was where he'd left me, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. He had no idea that the version of me lying beside him at night was already gone, that the woman who used to beg for his attention now observed him with surgical detachment, that the hands that folded his shirts and cleaned his dishes were the same hands drafting a plan to disappear. There was a strange satisfaction in that, in knowing I was slowly becoming invisible to him in the same way he had become irrelevant to me. But it didn't make the pain go away. It just gave it a purpose. One night, I came across an old email from a woman I used to volunteer with years ago. She had moved out of state, started a business, left her own version of a Matthew behind. I reread her words over and over again. They never expect us to rise. That's why we do. I wrote it down and taped it inside Jacob's closet where I kept my laptop and cash stash. It became my silent mantra, my reason, my answer to every moment of doubt. They never expect us to rise. That's why we do. Matthew slept soundly through every shift. Through the nights, I researched small business loans. Through the early mornings, I emailed clients. Through the weekends, I took Jacob to free libraries and sat with a book in one hand and my notes in the other. He didn't notice the long hours, didn't ask about the extra screen time, as long as I smiled when he needed me to, and didn't complain when he came home late. He assumed I was still exactly where he wanted me, beneath him, dependent, passive. Small, but I was not small. I was coiled. Quiet, yes, but only so I could gather force. My tears in the night weren't a weakness. They were an overflow, a release valve to keep the machine running. I cried because I still cared, because I was still human. But each time when the sobs died down and my breathing steadied, I felt more certain. I would leave. I didn't know how or when, but I would. And when I did, it wouldn't be with screams or vengeance or spectacle. It would be with silence, with precision, with Jacob holding my hand, and my name on a door he'd never be invited to knock on. The thing about crying in silence is that eventually you learn how to build from it. You start to hear things in the quiet that you couldn't hear before. Your own voice, your own power, the outlines of a future that no longer includes them. He slept peacefully, while I carved my way out of the life he thought I'd never escape. He dreamed comfortably, while I planned wide awake. And one day, when I'd be the one sitting behind a desk and he'd be the one nervously sweating in a cheap suit, he would finally understand the difference between sleep and peace. between silence and surrender, between the woman he discarded and the one who rebuilt herself in the dark. There are words you forget the moment they're said, and others that etch themselves into your bones the second they leave someone's mouth. That sentence, "If you want to leave, go, but good luck with a kid and zero potential," didn't echo like something shouted. It settled like dust in a room no one had cleaned in years. It wasn't yelled in a fight. There was no dramatic slam of the door, no glass breaking, no storm of rage. He said it while checking his phone, half turned away from me, like a casual aside spoken over coffee, like I wasn't even worth the effort of eye contact. We weren't fighting. Not really. I had simply asked him, calmly, if he ever saw a future with us. The room had gone still. He glanced up, shrugged, and delivered the line with such calculated indifference that I didn't even feel it at first. It was only later, much later, that I realized it had shattered something permanent in me, something sacred. I stood there for a few moments, trying to process what he had just said, but the numbness arrived too quickly, blanketing my thoughts like cold fog. He walked out of the room as if he had answered a question about the weather, leaving me alone with the sting of my own expectations. The silence after that was louder than anything. It was the final confirmation of what I had known for a while, but hadn't let myself say aloud. There was no love left here. Not from him. Maybe not even from me. Only habit. Only survival. Only the dull repetition of disappointment dressed up in the fragile fabric of hope. Jacob was playing in the other room, building towers out of secondhand blocks, humming the same off-key lullaby he always did when he was focused. I didn't want to interrupt him. I didn't want to bring that darkness into his world. Not yet. But I sat on the edge of the couch and stared at the same fraying cushion I had stitched 3 times and realized I was done. Not with anger. Not even with bitterness. I was just done pretending there was something to salvage. Leaving wasn't a decision. It was a surrender to the truth. And the truth was, I had stayed for too long, trying to keep together something that had been hollow from the start. He saw me as an obligation, a woman he could toss dismissive comments at when bored, a vessel for domestic chores and emotional endurance. He didn't fear losing me because he didn't think I had anywhere to go. That was the point of that sentence. He wasn't just telling me to leave. He was telling me that if I did, I'd collapse, that the world wouldn't want me, that I wasn't worth carrying forward, that I, and the child I bore, were not an asset, but a burden too heavy for anyone else to carry. He believed that with his whole chest, and maybe, once upon a time, I had believed it too, but not anymore. That night, after Jacob had fallen asleep, I stood by his bed longer than usual. He looked so peaceful, one arm over his head, the other clutching his stuffed dog like it was his compass. I remembered the night I went into labor, alone, afraid, in a hospital room lit too brightly for comfort. I remembered holding Jacob for the first time, the way his tiny fist closed around my finger like he already knew the world would try to shake him, and he'd need to hold on tight. I had brought that boy into this world. I had kept him safe. I had fed him, bathed him, read to him, taught him how to be kind even when kindness wasn't reflected back. I had worked jobs that bruised my hands and starved my sleep, just to give him a cracked roof over his head and warm soup in his stomach. And I had done it all without Matthew's help. His contribution had always been conditional, transactional, laced with silent contempt. And yet, he had the audacity to say I had zero potential. I went into the living room, sat down, and wrote a list. Not of grievances, not of regrets. A plan, step by step. What I had, what I needed, where I could go, who I could call. It wasn't long, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. A list written not out of desperation, but out of determination. I had stayed long enough to learn how to leave. That mattered more than anything. Over the next 2 days, I moved like smoke. Quiet, unnoticed, without confrontation. I began taking things out of the apartment. Small, useful things. My flash drive, Jacob's vaccination records, a few clothes, the USB charger I'd hidden $50 bills in for months. I kept a backpack in the back of Jacob's closet, adding to it little by little, waiting for the right moment. I played the role of the cooperative partner, the agreeable shadow. He didn't suspect a thing. That's the thing about narcissists. They only see reflections of themselves. They rarely notice when a woman begins to disappear until she's already gone. I told Jacob we were going to visit a friend, that we might stay a while. He nodded like it was just another one of our little adventures. I packed his favorite cereal, his second favorite pajamas, and a drawing he had made of the three of us, which I folded carefully into a book. Not because it was true, but because it was once what I wished could be. The moment we left was anticlimactic. No drama, no screaming. Just a door closing gently behind us, and a streetlight flickering as we walked away. I didn't cry. My hands were shaking, but my face was calm. I was holding Jacob's hand, and that was all that mattered. We took a bus to a part of town Matthew would never think to look in. A small studio above a laundromat where the landlady accepted cash and didn't ask too many questions. It smelled like detergent and cigarettes, but it was clean. It was ours. That night, Jacob fell asleep on the mattress we laid on the floor, curled up like a comma. I sat beside him, my back against the peeling wall, the street noise humming through the thin glass like a lullaby made of sirens and broken mufflers. I didn't sleep much, but I didn't cry either. I had done it. I had left. Not with fanfare, not with someone coming to save me. Just me and my son, and the weight of a future still unwritten. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't have all the answers, but I had air. I had space. I had silence that no longer felt like punishment. And most of all, I had the freedom to prove him wrong. The phrase he had thrown at me, so casually, as if it would haunt me forever, "Good luck with a kid and zero potential," no longer echoed like a curse. It became a mantra, a challenge, a flag I would carry into the life I was about to build. Every time I struggled, every time I felt afraid or overwhelmed, I would remember that moment, that sentence, and use it like fuel. Not to get revenge. Not yet. That part would come later, sweeter and colder than he could ever imagine. For now, I just needed to survive, to rise, to become everything he said I couldn't, everything he never dreamed I would, everything he would one day watch from the other side of a glass door, resume in hand, trembling as I let him speak, just long enough to remember exactly what he threw away. The mattress was too thin, the room too cold, and the noise from the street below bled through the cracked window frame like a restless heartbeat. But when I laid Jacob down that first night, pulling the threadbare blanket over his small shoulders, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Stillness. Not silence. Not numbness. Stillness. The kind that doesn't come from the world being quiet, but from the war inside finally pausing. I sat on the floor beside him, back against a wall that smelled faintly of mildew, knees pulled to my chest, and I watched him sleep, his breathing soft and even, his face relaxed, no tension between the brows, no flinching when someone entered the room, just sleep, real sleep. We had nothing, and still, it felt like a beginning. The floor creaked when I shifted. There were no curtains on the window yet, just the yellow-orange spill of the street lamp painting the walls in uneven patches. I had tucked the small stash of cash into the lining of my old winter coat, folded it beneath a pillow made of rolled-up sweaters. The backpack we'd left with sat in the corner, deflated and half unzipped, as if exhausted by the journey itself. I stared at it for a long time, as if it might offer some reassurance. It didn't, but Jacob's soft breathing did. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was afraid, but because my body didn't know what to do without tension. I lay beside him, eyes open to the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of a city I didn't know anymore. I heard laughter 2 floors down, the rumble of an engine that wouldn't start, someone dragging furniture across a tiled floor at 2 a.m. The world kept spinning, unaware that mine had just been reborn. I had left behind not just a man, but an entire version of myself. A version built on eggshells and apology. Now, I was nothing but a woman on a floor with her child, carrying nothing but the weight of her own quiet hope. The next morning, I woke to the smell of detergent rising through the floorboards and the soft buzz of machines from the laundromat downstairs. Jacob was still asleep, his hand curled around the corner of the blanket. I moved slowly, my joints stiff from the cold, and stood up. My legs ached. My back protested. But I smiled. There was something sacred about pain that comes from doing the right thing. I padded to the window and looked out at the street. Cars, people, a mother walking 2 kids in mismatched jackets, a man arguing with a parking meter. Life, unfiltered, unfolding around me like I had finally rejoined it. I made a mental list of what we needed. Food, clothes, maybe a small lamp for the corner. There was no table, no chairs, just 2 spoons, 1 pan, and a single plastic bowl I had borrowed from the landlady. But it was ours. The first thing I bought was a pack of instant oatmeal and 2 apples. Jacob didn't complain. He ate cross-legged on the floor, telling me stories about his dreams, his words bouncing off the bare walls like music. I listened, fully, without distraction, without the weight of pretending to be someone else's piece. I told him we were going to make this new place special, that it might take time, but we would turn it into something warm, something safe. He nodded solemnly, like he understood more than he should. I had 1 client left from my last freelance gig, a woman who ran a blog about parenting. She had always paid on time, always been kind. I emailed her from a nearby cafe, where I could borrow Wi-Fi with the purchase of a lukewarm coffee. I told her I was available for more work, flexible hours, short deadlines. She replied in less than an hour. She said she'd love to have me back. That was the first brick. Not a breakthrough, not a miracle, just a brick. And I took it and laid it down mentally, knowing I'd build one at a time if I had to. I worked while Jacob watched cartoons at the cafe. I worked while he colored in the corner of the studio, balancing my laptop on a pillow on my lap. I worked until my fingers hurt and my shoulders throbbed. I had no ergonomic chair, no office, no desk, but I had purpose. And with every invoice sent, every dollar earned, I felt something else shifting in me, like muscles waking up after years of disuse. I was capable. Not extraordinary, not genius, just capable. And that was enough. Matthew didn't call. He didn't look for us. Not once. It didn't surprise me. I had become a ghost long before I left. And ghosts don't get phone calls. He probably assumed I'd crumble, that I'd crawl back within weeks, desperate, ashamed, begging. He didn't know that peace is louder than pain, that once you've tasted even a sliver of freedom, you don't go back to cages, not even gilded ones, especially not the ones you were convinced you deserved. The nights stayed cold for a while. I layered sweaters on Jacob and used my coat as a blanket for myself. But I slept, deeply, not always comfortably, but truly. I dreamed again, not of rescue, not of revenge, but of building, of a little office with my name on the glass, of a school where Jacob would run in without looking back, of laughter that didn't feel strained, of mornings that didn't begin with dread. I dreamed of owning time, of making choices without permission, of becoming the kind of woman who no longer apologized for taking up space. Eventually, I bought a rug, a cheap, scratchy thing from a second-hand shop, but it covered most of the floor. Then came a lamp, a bookshelf someone had left on the curb. Jacob painted it blue with old tempera I found in a clearance bin. We filled it with library books and crayons and folded shirts. Every new item felt like a declaration. We are still here. We are still standing. We are still building. One morning, Jacob asked me why we didn't go back. I asked him, back where? He pointed vaguely in the air and said, back to where he was. I didn't lie. I said, because this is better. He didn't argue, just nodded and went back to his cereal, chewing thoughtfully like a small sage. Children understand safety, even if they can't name it. He knew, and so did I. I started using a different email for new clients. I stopped using my last name when I published articles. I created boundaries, slowly and deliberately, until I could breathe again without fear of being seen by the wrong eyes. I wasn't hiding. I was protecting. There's a difference. And with every precaution, I felt stronger. Like the version of me that once cried into her hands in a locked bathroom was still there, but no longer alone. She had become part of a larger whole, a woman who had slept on the floor but did not sleep in fear. Peace is not the absence of noise. It's the absence of someone else's weight on your soul. And as I sat on that rug with a cracked mug of instant coffee, watching the morning sun climb across the wall, I realized I had found something worth more than safety. I had found the beginning of myself, the version of me that had been buried beneath criticism, gaslighting, manipulation, and exhaustion, was now blinking in the light. Not healed, not whole, but rising. And that was enough for now. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't the kind of job that made you feel like you had arrived anywhere. But it was mine. A product description package for an online store that sold reusable kitchen cloths. 20 pages of variations on words like absorbent, durable, eco-friendly. The pay was modest, almost insulting. Barely enough to cover the electricity bill I now had to pay in cash at the post office, because I didn't have a checking account anymore. But when the email came in confirming the assignment, with a deadline of 48 hours, I felt the kind of electricity that has nothing to do with lights or bills. It was validation. A stranger somewhere was willing to pay me money for the way I arranged words. It was a start. It was a crack in the ceiling that let a little bit of sky show through. Jacob had fallen asleep early, his head resting on a stack of borrowed books, his breath warm and steady against the thin blanket we still used for everything. Bedspread, picnic mat, cape, shield. I lifted him gently, placed him on the mattress, and stood in the center of the room looking around as if I might find a desk I had forgotten existed. I settled on the floor, legs folded beneath me, my laptop propped up on a cushion that sank with each keystroke. The glow of the screen was the only light in the room, a blue halo that made the corners seem further away than they were. I opened a blank document, took a breath, and began. At first, the words came slowly. Every sentence felt forced, mechanical. I reread the client brief 6 times, trying to imagine what they wanted from someone like me. Someone whose resume included a bachelor's degree that had never been finished, a 5-year employment gap labeled only as family caretaker, and a silence that had cost me everything I once thought stable. But I had something that couldn't be put on a resume: urgency, hunger, a kind of quiet desperation that sharpens the mind into a weapon. So I leaned in. I researched microfiber density and bamboo fiber blends, comparing thread counts like I was preparing for a court case. I created categories, rearranged bullet points, wrote 6 variations of a product headline until I found the one that felt like it might make someone click, add to cart. The hours disappeared. Midnight slipped into 2, and then into 4. I worked through the stillness, sipping lukewarm tea from a chipped mug I'd found in the communal bin outside the laundromat. The world outside our window was asleep, but I was building something. Something invisible, maybe, but real. Every sentence I typed was another step away from dependence. Another brick in the wall that would someday keep men like Matthew out of my life for good. I didn't think about him that night. Not really. He had faded to background static, a shape in the mist. What mattered now was the growing awareness that I could earn, that I had value no one could diminish or dismiss with a smirk. At some point, my hands began to cramp, my fingers stiffening around the keys. I stood up, paced the room twice, stretched my arms, rolled my neck. I glanced at Jacob, still curled up with his knees tucked beneath him, a faint smile on his lips, like he was dreaming of running. I smiled too, not because things were perfect. They weren't. We were still broke, still sleeping on the floor, still living meal to meal and praying nothing broke down or went wrong. But we were free, and freedom, even when it comes with hunger and insomnia, is worth more than gold. By 6 a.m, I had finished the job. I read it over twice, checking for typos, trimming the fat, smoothing the tone. I clicked send, and sat back with a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for 7 years. Not since I left school. Not since I got pregnant. Not since the first man walked away and the second one taught me how to disappear into my own silence. I had done something for myself, earned something, delivered something. That email confirmation, the one that would arrive 2 hours later with the words, "Thanks, looks great," would become one of the most important messages I would ever receive, not because of what it paid, but because of what it meant. I lay down on the floor next to Jacob, fully clothed, laptop still glowing faintly in sleep mode. The sun hadn't yet breached the window, but the sky was lightening, soft blue curling behind the buildings. I pulled the blanket over my shoulders and closed my eyes. For the first time in months, sleep found me easily. Not the haunted kind, Not the kind full of regrets and what-ifs and imaginary arguments with people who never listened anyway. Just rest. Earned, honest, bone-deep rest. When I woke a few hours later, Jacob was sitting beside me, humming to himself while drawing circles on the floor with a crayon. I stretched, winced at the soreness in my back, and smiled at him. He looked up and said, "You stayed up all night, didn't you?" I nodded. "Was it a big project?" I hesitated, then said, "Yeah, big enough." He handed me a drawing. Me at a desk, him beside me, the sun in the corner smiling down on both of us. I hung it up with tape on the wall above our mattress. Later that week, I'd get 2 more assignments. A month later, I'd get referred to a small business owner who needed help with newsletters. Then a content agency. Then a contract. But I'd always remember that first job, those 20 pages about kitchen cloths. And the night I wrote them on the floor with no heat, no backup plan, no support but my own resolve. It wasn't a career, not yet, but it was the beginning of one. The first stone in a staircase I would carve with my own hands, bleeding if necessary, but steady. I wasn't going to build an empire out of revenge or spite. That would come later. For now, I was building it out of necessity. Out of the certainty that no man, no matter how polished or dismissive, would ever again be able to look at me and say, "You have 0 potential." Because even if the world didn't see it yet, I had touched it with my own hands, seen it take shape on a screen under flickering light, and sent it out into the world like a seed. I would plant thousands more. And one day, when he stood in front of me again, unaware of what I had become, I would remember this night, not with bitterness, but with pride, because while he was sleeping peacefully in the bed of his next temporary conquest, I was here, awake, writing, building, becoming. It started with a spiral-bound notebook I had picked up from the clearance bin of a convenience store 2 blocks from the studio. The cover was cracked, bent at the corners and decorated with faded stars and the word "Believe" in a font clearly designed for middle schoolers, not women trying to escape their own erasure. But I held it in my hands like something sacred, because it was blank. It was open. It was mine. There was something powerful about clean pages when your past has been written by other people. I brought it home that day wrapped in the same plastic bag I used for groceries, pressed it against my chest like a passport, and sat down cross-legged on the rug in the middle of our one-room life. Jacob was drawing beside me, content to be close. The sun filtered in through the window, warming the pages. I opened to the first line and began, not with a business plan, not with a vision board, just with a question. What do I know how to do that no one can take away from me? I didn't answer it right away. I let it hang there, patient and sharp. Over the next days and weeks, I returned to that notebook like it was a map. I wrote down everything I had learned, even the things Matthew had mocked. You research too much. So I listed research. You write like you're trying too hard. So I wrote down writing. You take everything so seriously. So I added empathy. You're too careful. I wrote strategy. It became a quiet act of defiance, reclaiming the things I had once tried to mute in myself to keep the peace. I filled page after page with ideas, scrappy, small, unformed, brand names that didn't make sense, blog post titles, target audiences, notes from free webinars I watched through lagging Wi-Fi, articles on SEO, content funnels, conversion rates. I didn't understand half of what I was reading, but I copied it anyway. I figured the understanding would come. The willingness already had. At night, when Jacob was asleep and the world shrank to the glow of my laptop and the buzz of neon from the storefront across the street, I worked. I opened a free website builder and started playing with templates. I created mock landing pages for fake companies just to practice tone and voice. I wrote sample emails, newsletters, taglines. I experimented with fonts and colors. I gave myself assignments. Write 3 blog posts by sunrise. Create an ad campaign for a product that doesn't exist. Pitch yourself to a stranger. I failed, over and over. My first email pitches were awkward. My first writing samples too long, too self-conscious. But I kept going. I kept refining. I kept forgiving myself for not knowing yet. I had no mentor, no investors, no circle of support. Just a notebook full of messy hope, and the steady drumbeat of necessity. There was a moment one night when I looked at the homepage I had built and felt something crack open inside me. It was plain. No fancy logo. No sleek branding. Just a simple introduction and a promise. Helping you tell your story, clearly and with care. I stared at that line for a long time. It felt small, but it was true. And truth, I was learning, was the foundation of everything worth building. I had told so many lies to survive, smiles that weren't real, apologies I didn't mean, gratitude I didn't feel. But here, in this tiny corner of the internet, I could be honest. I was a single mom with no degree, no funding, and no time to waste. But I could write, and I could listen, and I could build trust. That would be my business. That would be my brand. The first time I got paid more than $50, I cried. Not the silent tears of heartbreak or exhaustion. These were hot, choking sobs of disbelief. I checked the payment notification twice, as if it might disappear. It didn't. Someone had hired me to write a series of emails for a wellness coach in Canada. They had found my website through a comment I had left on a Facebook group. It wasn't much money, but it covered a week's worth of groceries and half the electricity bill. More than that, it covered a hole in my belief. A hole I didn't know was still there until that moment. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was earning. I was contributing. I was becoming someone my son could look up to without confusion. Over time, I gave the notebook a name. Foundation. It held everything. Budgets. Client lists. Drafts of contracts I copied from free legal websites. Notes on how to price my services without flinching. It became the heartbeat of my new life. If the apartment caught fire, I told myself, that notebook would be the first thing I grabbed. Not because of the content, because of the commitment it represented. The version of myself I was choosing. Over and over. In pen. Matthew still hadn't called. Still hadn't asked where we went. Some days I imagined him scrolling through social media, looking for a trace of me. He wouldn't find any. I had deleted every account we once shared, changed usernames, blocked old contacts. I lived offline, in silence, in the spaces he couldn't reach. But in the quiet, I was growing louder. My presence was small but steady. I was no longer the woman he looked through. I was becoming someone with a voice, with invoices, with follow-ups and feedback loops. I started keeping track of every win, no matter how small, in the back pages of the notebook. Client replied, "Loved this." Finished draft in one night. Paid rent on time. Jacob laughed until he snorted juice. These were my metrics. These were my milestones. One night, as I was wrapping up a website audit for a startup that had somehow found me through a referral, Jacob sat beside me, watching intently. He pointed to the screen and asked, "Is this your company?" I hesitated. Then I said, "Yes, it is." He smiled, nodded, and went back to drawing. I don't think I had ever said it out loud before, not even to myself. But hearing it, feeling it, naming it, it mattered. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I wasn't waiting for someone to tell me I was good enough. I had built something from nothing, and it was real. Clients were returning. Payments were increasing. My calendar was filling with deadlines. I had even started saying "we" when referring to the business, because in my mind, Jacob was part of it. He was my why, my anchor, my proof. I didn't want to be rich. I wanted to be free. I wanted to wake up without the weight of another person's judgment crushing my chest. I wanted to buy Jacob new shoes without checking price tags 3 times. I wanted to stop counting coins at the checkout line and pretending it was for fun. I wanted to answer to myself. And every day, with every page, I was getting closer. The empire wasn't built yet, but the soil had been tilled, the seeds planted, and I was watering them with ink and grit. I kept the notebook close, even as I began using spreadsheets and online tools. It reminded me where I started, on the floor of a studio apartment, with a child asleep beside me and nothing but hunger in my veins. It reminded me that independence doesn't arrive with fanfare. It arrives in fragments, in late nights, in invoices sent while your hands are shaking, in the courage to believe your ideas have value, even if no one has told you they do, especially then. Matthew once said, "No one would ever want a woman like me," that I had too much baggage, too little promise. But he had only ever looked at the broken parts. He never saw what I was building underneath. A woman, a notebook, and a dream called independence. That was all it took. And it would be enough. Enough to carry me into the next chapter. Enough to one day sit across from him with calm eyes and a red pen. Enough to say, without rage or sorrow, "Nice to see you again, Matthew," and mean it. Not as revenge, as a fact, as proof, as the final punctuation at the end of a story he never bothered to read. It was raining the day I signed the lease. A slow, gray drizzle that misted the sidewalks and turned the windows of the real estate office into smudged mirrors. I remember because I didn't have an umbrella, and Jacob and I arrived with damp shoulders and muddy shoes, our breath forming little clouds in the air as we stepped through the threshold of what would become the next layer of everything I had been building in silence. The space was small, barely 3 rooms if you counted the cramped bathroom that smelled like old pipes and lavender cleaner, but it had a door with a lock that belonged to me, and a front window I could imagine filling with quiet confidence. It wasn't polished. It wasn't sleek. But it was mine, and I chose it, not because I needed to expand, but because I needed to take up space. Physical, visible, undeniable space. I needed to move from hiding behind a laptop in a borrowed room to standing upright in a place that said, "I exist. I belong here. I am not asking. I am taking." The sentence that pushed me over the edge, the one that finally made me call the number on the "for rent" sign, came from Matthew, of course. It had arrived through a whisper, almost as an afterthought, slipped into the end of a voicemail he had left after months of silence. He hadn't called to check on Jacob. He hadn't asked where we were. He called, I realized, because someone had told him I was doing something online, and curiosity was a vice he never could resist. The message was filled with casual venom. "Hey, just heard through the grapevine you're trying to start some kind of, I don't know, business? Writing gig? Whatever. Just be careful, okay? You're not exactly built for this kind of pressure. I mean, come on. Be realistic. You're going to fail alone." He chuckled at the end, like he was doing me a favor, like that was concern, like it wasn't a sentence he had waited months to deliver like a final nail. I didn't delete the voicemail. I listened to it once. Then I wrote it down, word for word, on a blank sheet of paper, and pinned it to the inside cover of my notebook. Not to reread it, not to wallow, but to remember, to crystallize the moment, because something shifted in me after that call. I had already left him, already rebuilt myself brick by crumbling brick, already found peace sleeping on the floor, and purpose in the blue glow of freelance deadlines. But this was different. This wasn't survival anymore. This was ignition, a dare wrapped in arrogance, a door he didn't mean to open, but couldn't help himself from cracking, and I walked through it without flinching. The lease was modest, month to month, with a deposit that nearly drained what I had saved over the previous 4, but I paid it without hesitation. I filled out the paperwork with a borrowed pen, my handwriting careful, as if the way I formed each letter could convince the universe I belonged in that building. The woman at the front desk handed me the keys and said, "It's not much, but it's yours." I didn't correct her. It wasn't not much. It was everything. It was a line drawn in the sand between who I had been and who I was about to become. That first week, I worked with my coat still on. The heating didn't kick in properly, and I couldn't afford a space heater yet. I sat cross-legged on the floor of the main room, using overturned milk crates as a desk until I could find something sturdier on the curb. The walls were bare, the lights buzzed faintly, and the window was smudged with fingerprints from whoever had been there before me. But I had brought a candle from the dollar store, and I lit it every morning like a ritual. The scent was called fresh linen, though it smelled more like vanilla and chalk. Still, it gave the air a softness that made me feel less like an intruder and more like a woman moving into her own skin. Jacob visited after school, sometimes doing his homework in the corner while I typed up reports and cleaned up copy drafts. He asked if we could bring in plants. I said yes, even though I had no idea how we'd keep them alive. We brought in 1 cactus and a pothos in a chipped pot. We named them. He said the office needed life. He was right. Clients noticed the change, even when they didn't know it had happened. I responded faster. I sounded more confident. I charged more. I stopped apologizing in emails. I stopped using phrases like, just wondering, and sorry to bother. I stopped shrinking my own presence to make room for doubt. When one client asked for a rush job without offering rush payment, I said no, politely, firmly. He respected it. When another tried to undercut my rate, I referred him to someone else. He came back a month later and paid double. These were small victories, maybe, but they stacked like stones, forming a fortress around the version of myself I was no longer willing to compromise. Matthew didn't call again, but I imagined him often, not out of longing. That had long since died. I imagined him scrolling through job listings, looking for something better than whatever office he had coasted into. I imagined him hearing about me through someone else, someone who mentioned my name in a meeting or showed him a piece of copy he liked, only to discover it came from that woman, the one he said had no potential, no chance, no future. I imagined the flicker of discomfort behind his eyes. Not regret, just surprise, the kind that comes from realizing the ground has shifted beneath you while you weren't looking. I framed the first check I received under my business name. It wasn't large, but it had weight. I hung it in the office next to Jacob's drawing of me at a desk, under a sun that still smiled too brightly. The day I filed for my business license, I wore a blazer I had found at a thrift store and signed my name with a pen that had cost more than a meal. It felt dramatic. It felt earned. I had spent years erasing myself to make room for other people's comfort. Now, I signed things with a hand that no longer shook. The office began to fill slowly. One second-hand desk, a rolling chair that squeaked, a bulletin board covered in colored sticky notes that Jacob liked to rearrange into monsters. I didn't need much. Just air. Just a lock. Just a window that faced east so the light came in before noon. I brought in a coffee maker eventually, and a mini fridge, and kept snacks in the bottom drawer for Jacob. He told me one afternoon that he liked the smell of the place better than our apartment. I asked him why. He said, "It smells like you're doing something real." He didn't know how right he was. There were still hard days. Nights I stayed too late. Clients who didn't pay on time. Deadlines that stole sleep. But I never once considered quitting. Not because I thought I couldn't fail, but because I had already failed by staying where I didn't belong. This wasn't about proving Matthew wrong anymore. This was about proving myself right. I was no longer running. I was claiming. Brick by brittle brick. Word by word. Check by check. The voicemail still lived inside the notebook, but I never played it again. I didn't need to. It had done its job. "You're going to fail alone," he had said. He had meant it as a curse, but it turned out to be a kind of spellbreaker. Because yes, I was alone, but I was not failing. I was expanding, occupying space, answering to myself, raising a child in a world I was building from scratch, without shame. And each time I locked up that office for the night and walked home beneath the streetlights, keys in hand, I carried more than just a bag of files and tomorrow's to-do list. I carried proof, not for him, for me, that I had been broken, yes, but never empty, that I had been underestimated, dismissed, erased, but never destroyed. And that, maybe, was the real miracle. Not that I had survived him, but that I had made a place where his voice no longer echoed. Only mine. Steady, certain, earning, becoming. It wasn't a goal. I hadn't pasted it to a vision board or scribbled it in the margins of my notebook. I wasn't chasing recognition. In fact, I was doing everything in my power to remain low, to build slowly and silently, without drawing attention to myself. There's a kind of safety in quiet progress, in keeping your victories small and private, in growing roots instead of branches. For years I operated like a woman in witness protection. No selfies, no hashtags, no loud announcements. Just word-of-mouth referrals, late-night strategy calls, polite LinkedIn messages, steady invoices, and a client base that expanded one trusted recommendation at a time. I didn't need applause. I needed control. I needed proof that I could live a full, dignified life without ever being seen by the man who once vowed I would amount to nothing. The work grew like ivy, slow, persistent, wrapping around cracks in the system no one else had bothered to look at. I offered strategy and storytelling to women-led startups, to nonprofits run by single mothers, to therapists launching digital clinics. to coaches who wanted to rewrite their origin stories without shame. I saw them. I knew their voices because I had lived them. I wrote with a precision that came from surviving silence. My words weren't clever. They were true. And in an online world bloated with noise, truth whispered with clarity is louder than anything. Still, I wasn't prepared when it happened. The email landed in my inbox on a Tuesday morning, nestled between a payment receipt and a confirmation that Jacob's school would be closing early for maintenance. Subject line: Feature Opportunity, She Builds Magazine. I almost deleted it. Thought it was spam. But something in the language made me pause. The editor, a woman named Alicia, explained that they were doing a special issue on women who had built businesses from the margins. Women who had started with nothing, with no capital, no connections, no clout. Women who had built not despite being invisible, but because they had been. She had heard about me from someone I'd worked with over a year ago. They said your work made them feel like they had a voice again, Alicia wrote. That your copy gave them back their story, that you helped them remember who they were. I reread the sentence 5 times, then again, then closed the laptop, walked into the bathroom, and stared at myself in the mirror. My reflection had changed. My eyes were sharper, my skin lined by late nights and deadlines and weathered courage. But the woman staring back wasn't surprised. She looked like she'd known all along this moment would come. She just hadn't said it out loud. I almost said no. The old instincts kicked in. Stay small. Stay safe. But I thought of Jacob. How he'd grown. How he watched me work from the corner of the office. How he introduced me to his friends as my mom, the boss. I thought of every woman who had written me after I published an article under a pseudonym, telling me she felt seen, understood, less alone. I thought of the voicemail still pressed between the pages of my first notebook. You're going to fail alone. And I thought, maybe it was time to show the world what failure looked like from my side of the glass. The interview was over Zoom. I wore my best sweater, the one with a tiny stain near the collar I hoped wouldn't show. I spoke calmly, carefully, as if the words might be archived somewhere my past could find them. I told her about starting from a floor, about writing product descriptions at 3 a.m., about building a business one late invoice at a time. I didn't mention Matthew by name, but I spoke of the voices that had tried to shrink me, the sentences that had been handed to me like cages. What made you keep going? She asked. I didn't say revenge. I said Jacob. I said the need to look at my own hands and know they had built something no one else could take. When the magazine came out, I didn't know. Not right away. Alicia had sent me a courtesy copy, but it was delayed in the mail. It was a client who texted me first, then another, then 5 more. The cover wasn't flashy, just a white background, a bold title, and my face, full and framed in soft light, under a headline that read, The Architect of Quiet Power. I laughed. I cried. I sat down on the floor of the office, surrounded by sticky notes and half-finished content calendars, and I pressed my palm to my face on the screen like it might blink back. Jacob saw it later that evening. Is that really you? He asked. I nodded. He looked at it for a long time. Then he whispered, I always knew. I pulled him into my lap and held him there for a long time, his heartbeat steady against my chest. Does this mean we're rich now? He asked, and I laughed again. No, I said, but it means we're seen. The magazine didn't change everything. The invoices still needed chasing. The taxes still stressed me out. But the calls changed. The emails changed. My name was being mentioned in rooms I hadn't entered. Women reached out wanting to learn how I'd done it. How I'd built something that didn't rely on noise or networking events or perfectly filtered selfies. I told them the truth. I built it from the floor. From nights no one saw. From voicemails that were meant to bury me. From a refusal to let failure be the last word. Matthew called 2 weeks later. A number I hadn't saved. I recognized it immediately. I didn't answer. I let it ring. Then ring again. Then stop. Then come back. He left a message. Just one sentence. Saw your face today. You look different. I deleted it. No response. No anger. No need. He hadn't noticed me growing because I had done it in the one place he never looked. Outside of his shadow. I framed the magazine cover. hung it in the office beside the first check I'd ever received and the drawing Jacob made of me at my desk. It didn't symbolize fame or fortune. It symbolized reclamation, proof that I hadn't vanished. I had been building, slowly, deliberately, without needing to scream. Because power doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it grows like a secret. And then one day, it sits on a shelf with your name printed in bold letters, and the world finally sees what you knew all along. I didn't grow for him. I didn't rise to be recognized. But the recognition came anyway. And when it did, it wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, unapologetic, like me, like everything I had become, like the sound of a woman who had failed alone and come back whole. It was a Wednesday, warm and half-clouded, one of those days when the sky seems indecisive and the breeze feels like a rumor of seasons changing. The office smelled faintly of brewed coffee and lavender from a candle I had lit near the window, a ritual I kept no matter how hectic things became. Jacob had left for school with his backpack bouncing and his sneakers scuffing the hallway, and I had just finished finalizing a strategy proposal for a returning client when my assistant, an intern-turned-part-time coordinator named Milena, came into my office with a puzzled look on her face and a stack of digital printouts. "We've got a batch of new applicants for the ops position," she said. "Figured you'd want to take the first pass." She dropped them on the desk with a teasing smile and a glance that said she expected a sigh from me. I gave her one. She laughed, then left. I took a sip of coffee, glanced at the first few pages, names, degrees, half-true achievements typed in bold, hoping to impress, and began sorting without much thought, until I turned to the 7th page, and everything stopped. The name at the top of the resume was familiar in the way a cut that never healed is familiar. It was in bold size 12, centered above a phone number and an email that still carried the same unoriginal bravado, Matthew.rjames82, as if the world had been waiting for his initials. I stared at it longer than I needed to. I could feel my pulse in my neck, behind my eyes, in my wrists. Not anger, not fear, not even disbelief. Just that cold, sudden quiet that hits when the past walks back into the room without knocking. I looked down at the rest of the page. The job history was unimpressive. Assistant coordinator at a supply firm I'd never heard of, a brief stint in logistics, then a gap that ran nearly a year and a half long with only a vague bullet point. Independent contracting, project consulting. No links, no website, no specifics. But I didn't need them. I knew. I knew the tone, the half-formed sentences, the way he tried to dress thin experience in thick words. I knew the way he tried to sound like more than what he was. I had known that voice. I had lived inside it. He had applied for a mid-level management position in my operations department, a role he was objectively unqualified for. And yet there it was, his name in my inbox, his resume in my hands. I leaned back in my chair and let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding. The irony wasn't poetic. It was surgical. The man who once told me, with the smooth finality of someone confident in his ability to predict the limits of a woman's life, that I would fail alone, had submitted himself for consideration at the company I had built from the same bones he tried to break. I didn't laugh. I didn't cry. I just sat still, watching the paper in my hands as if it might start talking. Part of me wondered if he knew, if he had any inkling whose desk his resume would land on. My company wasn't built around me. I didn't slap my name across every page or brand every email with my story. It was about the work, about the mission, about giving women back their voices in the digital world. Still, I had done interviews. I had published articles. My face had been on that cover. But men like Matthew don't read past the headline. They don't imagine the women they discarded ever returning as gatekeepers. I didn't make a decision right away. I let the resume sit on my desk for a full day, like a test, like an omen. I kept working, took calls, reviewed proposals, gave Jacob a spelling test over dinner and read him 3 chapters of a new book at bedtime. But every so often my eyes would drift back to the page, to that name, to the arrogance of applying like this was just another job, like we were strangers, like history wasn't sitting right there in the bullet points he had dressed up in business casual. The next day I told Milena to schedule interviews for the top 5 applicants. "Include him," I said. My voice didn't waver. She raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? I nodded. Yeah. I want to hear what he has to say. We scheduled him for the 2 p.m. slot. I made sure the room was quiet, the blinds open, the lighting soft but unflattering. I wanted him to see clearly. Everything. I didn't tell the other staff who he was. There was no need. This wasn't about them. This was about me. When he walked in, he didn't recognize me right away. He looked thinner, older, his posture slightly collapsed, like a man who had lost too many things too quickly to remember how to stand up straight. His hair was shorter, his eyes duller. He wore a navy suit that didn't fit properly, the sleeves too long, the collar tugging against his neck like it was trying to escape him. He smiled that smile I had once memorized, the one that always arrived a fraction too late. Hi, thanks for having me, he said, offering his hand to Milena first, then to me. I didn't take it. I just nodded and gestured to the seat across from mine. He didn't flinch. He didn't ask questions. He sat down and launched into his pitch. He talked for 20 minutes. About his leadership background, about managing teams, about overseeing timelines and deliverables. It was all vague, all surface level, all bluster. He name-dropped software he didn't understand, and cited numbers that didn't track. I listened without interrupting, without blinking. I watched the man who had once told me I had nothing to offer try to prove he had something left. He didn't look at me the way a man looks at a stranger. He looked at me the way someone looks at an employee, a subordinate, even now, even there. When he paused, waiting, I think, for me to nod or affirm his greatness, I leaned forward and folded my hands on the table. It's nice to see you again, Matthew, I said quietly. His entire face shifted, not in fear, in confusion first, then realization, then something colder, regret, maybe, but not the honest kind, the panicked kind. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. I saw his eyes scan the room, saw the cogs in his mind trying to fit new information into an old schema. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just met his gaze and waited. Let it land. I didn't know, he started. I know you didn't, I said, but I did. He blinked. This is your company? Yes. He swallowed hard. I didn't realize. You wouldn't have. I stood then, slowly, calmly. I walked to the file cabinet, retrieved the standard rejection letter we kept for applicants who didn't qualify, and signed it with my red pen, the same pen I'd been using since the day I signed my first lease. I placed it gently into a folder and slid it across the table. Thank you for your time. He didn't take it right away. He stared at it like it might burst into flames. I turned toward the window, gave him a full view of the city skyline, the one I had earned, the one I had built floor by floor, word by word, night by sleepless night. He stood. You look different, he said, almost as if he couldn't stop himself. I am, I replied. He left without another word. I watched him disappear down the hall without turning back. Later that evening, I walked Jacob home from school, holding his hand while he told me about a science experiment involving baking soda and vinegar that exploded like a volcano, Mom, seriously. I laughed and asked him questions. We bought groceries, we made dinner, we did math homework. And while he brushed his teeth, I poured a glass of wine and stood at the window of our apartment, looking out at the city glowing in soft neon. I thought about the resume, the interview, the rejection, and I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel anything sharp or triumphant. I just felt done, clean. The door had closed, not with a slam, but with a final quiet click. And in the end, that was all the closure I ever needed. I arrived early that day, earlier than usual, earlier than I needed to. The office was still quiet, sun just beginning to slip through the blinds, casting long lines across the floor and over the small collection of framed things on the shelf beside my desk. Jacob's crayon drawing, the check that never cleared but meant everything, a copy of the magazine still in its plastic sleeve. I unlocked the door, turned on the lights, opened the windows just enough to let the breeze air out whatever trace of nerves might still be hiding in the corners of the room. I didn't need them. Not today. I had already made peace with everything that mattered, but I still needed to sit in the space, breathe it in, let it settle around me like armor. I made a fresh pot of coffee, not for the caffeine, but for the scent. It grounded me, Milena arrived with her usual backpack and her usual pace and the usual question already on her face. But before she could say anything, I looked at her and said calmly, "No interruptions at 2, even if the building is on fire." She blinked, then nodded slowly. She knew better than to ask. The hours moved as they always did. Emails, calls, files to sign, messages to return. The city outside pulsed as it always had, with its endless noise and half-breathed urgency, and I matched its rhythm as I always did. But somewhere in the back of my mind, like a low frequency only I could hear, the anticipation hummed. Not dread, not excitement, just inevitability. I wasn't staging anything. I didn't need to. I just wanted to witness it, to give it shape, to sit across from the man who once told me, so casually and with such certainty, that no one would ever want a woman like me, especially not one with baggage, and see if he could now even recognize the version of me he had tried so hard to shrink into nothing. At 1:58, I stepped into the conference room. I chose the seat at the head of the table, where the sunlight fell brightest, warming the dark wood in front of me. I laid out a blank notepad, a pen, blue, not red, not yet, and a single folder with his name printed cleanly in black ink. I sat with my spine straight, my breathing slow, my expression open but unreadable. When the door opened at 2:01 and he stepped inside, I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just looked at him and let the moment breathe. He had dressed like he was trying to impress someone, but not me. A stiff shirt, a blazer too snug at the shoulders, the kind of tie you grab off a clearance rack because it looks just corporate enough to fake confidence. His hair was combed carefully, his shoes recently polished, but the exhaustion in his face betrayed him. The undercurrent of desperation wasn't something you could iron out. He greeted Milena politely as she showed him in, then turned to me with that same half-smile I remembered, the one that once passed for charm, but now looked like a man trying to remember how to be liked. "Good afternoon," he said. "Matthew James." I nodded once. "Thank you for coming." He sat across from me, not recognizing me yet, or maybe unsure, not willing to believe his own memory. I watched him scan my face in pieces, trying to place me, trying to force my presence into some familiar box that would make this feel less off balance. But I gave him no help. I didn't break eye contact, didn't shift in my seat. I let the silence do what it needed to. He started to talk about his background, about his leadership philosophy, about how his experience in logistics had taught him to prioritize clarity and team dynamics. He used all the words people use when they're performing competency. He mentioned roles, glossed over the gaps, dressed up the redundancy of his past with language lifted from LinkedIn and career blogs. He spoke for 13 minutes before I said anything, and I didn't stop him. I let him build his illusion uninterrupted. When he finally paused, more from breath than punctuation, I leaned forward slightly, folding my hands on the table. My voice didn't rise. It didn't harden. It simply arrived, steady and measured. "It's nice to see you again, Matthew." The pause that followed was not silence. It was impact. I saw the change ripple across his face. Confusion first, then recognition, then the slow bloom of discomfort as the pieces fell into place. His mouth opened slightly, as if he might speak, but no sound came. His eyes darted once to the folder in front of me, then back to my face, and I watched his entire posture shift, not collapse, but falter. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I simply watched him take in the full picture of where he was, and who he was sitting across from. I didn't realize this was your company," he said finally, voice low, controlled. "I know," I said. He looked down at the table, then back up, searching for some footing in a conversation that had already slipped out from under him. "It's been a long time." "It has. You look different. So do you." He shifted in his seat, cleared his throat. "I'm not sure what to say." "You don't have to say anything," I replied. "This isn't a conversation. It's an interview." He blinked. "Oh, right. Of course." I opened the folder, glanced at the resume inside as if I hadn't already read it 3 times. "You've listed a number of responsibilities here that overlap with what we'd expect in the role," I said, "though I noticed some gaps in your employment history. Care to elaborate?" He flinched just slightly. There was a bit of Transition, he said. Some personal matters. I nodded. Of course. He tried to gather himself, leaning forward. Look, I know it might be awkward, but I really do believe I can contribute here. I've learned a lot. Grown a lot. Have you? I asked. Not accusing, not mocking, just asking. He hesitated. I closed the folder. I built this place, I said. From the floor, with a laptop and no help. I worked while my son slept beside me on a blanket, while I pitched clients in coffee shops, while I sent proposals with shaking hands. I built this company from rejection, from being told I had no potential, from the memory of a voice that told me, flatly, that no one would ever want me. He didn't speak. I reached into the drawer and pulled out a pre-written rejection letter. I had signed it that morning with the same red pen I'd used to sign my first lease. I slid it across the table, face up. He looked at it, but didn't touch it. You asked for this meeting, I said. You stepped into this room. You applied for a job at the company I built. I didn't know, he said again, quieter this time. I did, I answered. He stood, slowly, with a quiet breath that carried the weight of understanding, not of what I had become, but of what he had lost, what he had never even seen long enough to recognize. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't shake his hand. I let him leave without another word. The door clicked shut behind him with a finality I hadn't expected to feel so clean. I stayed in that room for a long time after, not thinking, not celebrating, just sitting, just existing. For the first time in a very long time, I allowed myself to feel not just proud, but finished. That chapter wasn't closed with rage or revenge. It was closed with clarity, with presence, with a woman giving her former captor the most devastating answer she could, indifference wrapped in undeniable success. He walked out with a folder he didn't take, and a silence he couldn't outrun. I stayed, at my desk, in my space, with my name on the door and my story folded carefully into every brick of the life I had built without him. He didn't leave the room right away, not completely. His body moved toward the door. Yes, his hand even reached for the knob, but something in his spine stalled, as if the weight of what had just happened hadn't quite reached his legs yet. I saw it in the way he paused, slightly turned like he might try to salvage it. Ask a question, offer an apology, fill the silence with something that might return his sense of power. But no words came. There was nothing left to say, and I wasn't about to offer him the kindness of a bridge back to comfort. So I sat still, behind the desk. He had just spent 20 minutes trying to perform his way across, and waited. It was in that pause, those few seconds before his hand finally pushed the door open, that he turned his head just enough to glance at me again, and with an almost confused expression said, "You look familiar." I let the moment bloom before I answered. I watched his eyes, how they narrowed slightly as his brain wrestled with the facts, the doubt, the recognition, the shame he hadn't yet decided to feel. "Maybe because you once said I'd never be anything," I said evenly, my voice like a window crack just wide enough to let the truth crawl in. His expression shifted slowly, like a man recalling a dream he'd dismissed as meaningless, only to realize it was a memory. The shape of my face, softened and aged by time but sharpened by resolve. The cadence of my voice, once muffled by hesitation, now crisp, calm, and measured. The eyes, those always give us away. He saw it then, not just who I was, but who I had been, and more importantly, who I no longer was. He blinked and looked down at the rejection letter on the table, as though it might tell him something about the timeline he'd missed. But it didn't. There were no clues in that ink, no redemption between the lines, just the same word I had heard for years. "No," finally handed back to him. His mouth opened slightly, perhaps to protest, perhaps to defend, but I tilted my head just a fraction, and that was enough. That tiny gesture, not dismissive but final, told him the conversation was over, that the chance to rewrite the past had expired, that I had nothing left for him, not anger, not pity, not even curiosity, only clarity. He stepped out. The door closed quietly, and still, I didn't move. Not yet. I stayed in that seat as the echo of his presence dissolved from the room, letting the silence settle back into place like a coat, reclaimed from the back of a chair. I looked down at the folder, at the place where his name had once felt like a wound. Now it was just a name, a placeholder for a version of myself I no longer carried. I tore the rejection letter in half, not as a gesture for him, but for me. He would never see it, but I needed to. I walked to the window. The city spread out below in steady motion. Somewhere out there he was walking, maybe replaying the meeting in his mind, trying to find a way to explain it to himself, trying to understand how the woman who had once stood in his kitchen with tear-swollen eyes and silence in her throat had become someone who could look him in the eye and offer nothing. That's the part that unsettles men like him. Not the success, not the office, not the resume, but the refusal to feel anything for them anymore. That is the real rejection. To become immune. I went back to my desk, back to my work, back to the list of clients who depended on my mind, my vision, my steadiness. There was a proposal waiting for review, a coaching call to prepare, a late payment to follow up on. I was needed. And not because someone chose to tolerate me, but because I had built something valuable with my own hands, something with weight and reach and impact. I belonged at that table, in that room, under my own name. I had earned it not once, but 100 times over. I didn't need his recognition. I already had my own. That evening I picked Jacob up from school. He was waiting near the bike racks, his backpack heavy with worksheets and crushed granola bars. He waved when he saw me, running up with a drawing clutched in his hand. "Look," he said breathlessly. "It's us. You're at your desk, and I'm bringing you coffee." I laughed and asked if I was smiling in the picture. "Yeah," he said. "You always smile when you work." I looked at the drawing carefully. A sun with a face beamed in the top corner, and tiny plants lined the bottom edge of the paper. "We're growing things," he explained. "You always say we're still growing." I kissed the top of his head and folded the drawing into my bag. We walked home, his small hand swinging in mine, his words tumbling out about science class, and who cheated at hopscotch, and whether dragons could be real if we just believed hard enough. I nodded and listened and laughed, and not once did my mind return to Matthew. Not once did I feel the pull of old stories or unresolved rage. I was here, with my son, in a life I had chosen, in a life I had earned. And the past, even when it knocks on your door dressed in regret and resumes, has no power unless you give it a seat at your table. That night, after Jacob was asleep, I lit the candle on my desk and opened my notebook. The original one, cracked spine, bent corners, pages softened from use. I flipped to the back where I had written the quotes that kept me steady. I added a new one. "You look familiar. Maybe because you once said I'd never be anything." I closed the book and smiled. He was right, in a way. I did look familiar, but not because I resembled the woman he once left behind. I looked familiar because I had finally become the version of myself I had been chasing in the shadows for years, and now she had stepped fully into the light. The pen had always been mine. A small, unassuming thing. Plastic body, translucent casing. The kind of red that looked more like dried wine than warning light. It wasn't expensive. It didn't glide across the page like silk. But it never failed. And maybe that was why I kept it. It had signed my first invoice, my first business license application, my first lease, my first contract that had made me cry. Not out of fear, but out of proof. And on the day I reached for it again, its weight in my hand was like muscle memory, like returning to a piece of myself that had been waiting patiently to be needed one more time. I took my time with the letter. Not because it required revision or thought. I had written it a dozen times before for applicants I didn't know, for people whose stories didn't intersect with mine. But this one was different. Not because it was Matthew, but because I needed to feel every stroke of the ink as it met the paper. I didn't want to rush it. I didn't want to make it an act of impulse. I wanted it to be deliberate, grounded, a gesture rooted in everything I had learned about choosing myself first. I dated it, printed his full name, and beneath the final paragraph that thanked him for his time and interest while declining to move forward with his application, I signed mine. Full name, no abbreviation, no initials, no hiding. There was something satisfying about the way the ink dried on the page, a soft crimson glint in the light of my desk lamp. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about punishment. It was closure delivered in the most mundane, administrative form imaginable, and maybe that's what made it perfect. I didn't need a speech. I didn't need to list the reasons, to dissect the history, to bring the past up for negotiation. I didn't need to remind him of the nights I cried beside him while he slept like the world owed him rest, and I owed him silence. I didn't need to ask if he remembered the day he told me that I had no future, because I wasn't seeking understanding. I was signing a boundary, and boundaries don't beg. I slid the paper into a folder, clipped it shut, and placed it on Milena's desk with a post-it note. Mail today. No delay. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. She knew not to ask. She had been with me long enough to recognize when something was finished. The kind of finished that didn't leave smoke or rubble behind. Just the quiet architecture of what remains standing after you rebuild from the ruins. The next morning, I found Jacob at the kitchen table drawing again. This time it was a mountain, 2 figures climbing side by side, clouds floating low, the sun high and triumphant. He looked up and said, "Do you think people ever regret not helping others up the hill?" I blinked at him, that strange, sharp ache of recognition blooming in my chest. "Maybe," I said carefully, "but by the time they realize it, we're usually too far ahead for them to catch up." He nodded like that made perfect sense and went back to coloring. I arrived at the office early again, not because I expected anything, but because I wanted the stillness. I wanted to sit in the chair that used to feel too big, at the desk that used to intimidate me, in the room I once feared would remain empty. I wanted to feel how far I'd come without needing someone else to measure it. The phone didn't ring. My inbox stayed quiet. There was no fallout, no echo, and that, more than anything, told me what I needed to know. He had received it. He had read it. And he had understood. Somewhere in a quiet apartment, I imagined him holding the envelope, the thick cream paper, the way his name looked typed neatly on the header. I imagined his eyes dropping to the bottom, to that last line, my signature, unmistakable, final. Maybe he stared at it. Maybe he tore it up. Maybe he kept it in a drawer he wouldn't open again for years. I didn't care. That letter wasn't for him. It was for me. There's a myth about revenge, that it must be loud and cinematic, served with fire and fury and broken glass. But the real kind, the kind that heals instead of poisons, is quiet. It wears no expression. It walks into a room with steady feet and speaks in complete sentences. It doesn't chase applause or demand acknowledgement. It closes the door with grace and never reopens it. That red pen had signed so many beginnings. But this, I realized, was the first time it had signed an ending. A few days later, a colleague forwarded me an article. A local business blog had published a list of rising female entrepreneurs under 40. My name was on it, near the top. They had included a small paragraph about my company's mission, our growth in the last year, and a quote I had forgotten giving in a panel about ethical marketing and storytelling. I read it once, then again, then printed it and pinned it to the corkboard beside my desk. Not for pride, for remembrance. The life I was living now was not the one anyone had written for me, not the one I had been expected to accept. It wasn't always easy. There were still days I missed deadlines, days I second-guessed, days I woke up and had to remind myself that I was allowed to be here. But then I would glance at the shelf, the drawing, the magazine, the framed check, and I would remember, not because they symbolized arrival, but because they reminded me how far the road had once stretched between me and the version of myself who thought she had to be chosen in order to matter. That afternoon, as I packed up to leave, I found the red pen in the bottom of my bag, where it had fallen loose from its clip. I held it in my hand for a moment, feeling its familiar weight. I didn't need it anymore. Not for signatures, not for statements. I placed it gently into a small glass jar on my desk, a keepsake now, a relic of the woman who had written herself into existence, one line at a time. I turned off the light, locked the door behind me, and stepped into the dusk. The city buzzed softly around me, cars blinking in rhythm, people moving in and out of their own chapters. I didn't look back. There was nothing behind me that needed revisiting, only forward now, only open sky, and the red ink of a life that had finally been written on my terms. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles in a building after hours, when the last phone call has ended, the last email sent, the chairs pushed in neatly beneath the tables, and the hum of ambition is finally allowed to exhale. That night, as the city darkened outside my windows and the elevator let out its final mechanical sigh for the day, I stood barefoot in the main hallway of my building. Yes, my building, keys in one hand, silence in the other, and I let myself feel everything. Not the noise of what it took to get here, not the weight of memory, or the phantom of doubt I had long since stopped feeding, but the fullness, the fact that I had taken nothing and turned it into a place people walked into with purpose and walked out of changed. I had bought the building the month before, closed the deal quietly with the same lawyer who had once told me, in a passing compliment during the signing of my lease, "You've got the kind of mind that can outlive circumstances." He was right. I had outlived more than that. I had outlived forecasts, failures, assumptions, and a man who once tried to rewrite my worth in a single sentence. It had started almost as a joke. Jacob, now 10 and taller than he had any right to be, had followed me to work one day during a school holiday and made himself a corner on the floor with his tablet, some paper, and a row of snacks. He declared it his branch office, complete with a handwritten sign on the door made from a post-it, and a pen he insisted on clicking until it died. "This is where I run my empire," he said, without looking up from his comic draft. I laughed, tousled his hair, and told him every good company needed a creative department. He grinned, then asked, "But when do I get a desk?" That night, I opened a layout sketch of the 3rd floor, the one I hadn't yet renovated, and drew a square in the corner. Just big enough for a desk, a lamp, and a chair too large for a child, but too small for a man who once believed that motherhood made me less capable. The renovations took a month. I kept the walls white and the window open. I had a carpenter install a custom desk, small but sturdy, and I let Jacob pick the chair himself. He chose a deep blue one with wheels that swiveled in wide arcs, saying he needed to think in motion. I stocked the drawers with art supplies and notebooks, a tiny stapler shaped like a shark, and a brass nameplate that read, "Jacob, founder in training." On the day it was ready, I brought him in with his eyes closed, led him up the stairs, and said, "You asked for a desk. Here's your office." He stared for a long time, then turned to me with a silence I knew well, full, not empty. Then he smiled, sat in the chair, spun in one long dizzying circle, and said, "We're going to build a lot of things here." That was the moment I allowed myself to believe, fully and without reservation, that the version of me who had once lain awake on a floor beside a sleeping child, staring at the ceiling and wondering how to stretch $30 across 6 days, was gone. Not vanished, not erased. She was part of me still, but she was no longer in charge. In her place stood a woman who owned the building her former self would have cleaned for minimum wage. A woman whose name was etched on contracts, whose signature carried weight, whose voice didn't quiver when spoken aloud. A woman who had not only survived the sentence, "No one will ever want a woman like you," but had used it as the foundation for a life that had no room for men like him. Matthew had faded, not dramatically, but like a stain scrubbed over and over, until all that was left was a vague shadow. I hadn't heard from him again after the rejection, and I hadn't tried to. People like him never know what to do with someone they tried to break, who doesn't just survive but thrives. He had written me off like a tax deduction, something he could forget once filed away, and I had used that space to build the very thing he said was impossible, not to spite him, but to honor myself. The rest came in waves. I hired more women, not out of charity or sentiment, but because I knew the hunger in their eyes. I recognized the way they leaned into every opportunity, their voices trembling at first until they steadied, grew, rooted themselves. I gave raises without being asked. I introduced flexible hours, childcare stipends, mental health days, not because I was trying to be revolutionary, but because I remembered how it felt to be punished for being human. And I wanted a company where humanity was part of the job description. At night sometimes, when the building emptied and the floors were still, and Jacob sat in his office drawing galaxies or writing jokes or pretending to take calls from imaginary clients, I would walk the halls. Just walk, remembering the steps it took to get here. not just the physical ones. The mornings where I had nothing but oatmeal and determination. The nights I cried so quietly, even my tears felt like trespassers. The rejections, the bills, the sharp, unrelenting whisper of self-doubt that hovered above my shoulder like smoke, and the way I had answered every one of those moments, not with certainty, but with action. You see, that's the part no one tells you, that healing doesn't come with grand epiphanies or sweeping cinematic moments. It comes in small, repeatable choices, in saying no when you're used to saying yes, in showing up again after being ignored, in signing your own name on something that once felt out of reach, in standing in your own space, with your child beside you, knowing you built it. And so when people ask, because now they do, they ask, "How did you do it?" I tell them the truth. I failed. Often. I doubted. Constantly. I cried. Quietly. I kept going. Always. I used the voice they tried to take and made it louder. I took the sentence they gave me and rewrote it. I turned, "No one wants a woman like you," into, "Even my son has an office in the company I created from nothing." That's the final answer. The quiet revenge. The perfect punctuation. I didn't become extraordinary to prove him wrong. I became whole to prove myself right. And the woman he left behind, tired, dismissed, and discounted, is no longer waiting for him to notice. She's too busy closing contracts, reviewing budgets, raising a son who knows what dignity looks like, and unlocking the front door of a building that bears no man's name but her own. And if he ever walks past this place again, if his gaze ever lingers on the glass facade with the lettering that reads like a whisper turned thunder, I hope he understands, not with bitterness, but with clarity, that it wasn't that no one would want a woman like me. It's that a woman like me would never want someone like him. Not ever again. Not even in memory.